G'day guys, welcome back to True Eagle. Things look a little bit brighter this week. Subconsciously, I think just coming off a win, there's just a sense of well-being. Or at least, it's still a contrast to the previous 10 weeks. And that's not to be taken as me getting ahead of myself just because we beat the Gold Coast Suns. I'm just talking about the fact that my football team won, and that hasn't been the case for about 3 months. I find myself, clicking onto various football shows like on YouTube and AFL.com.au and wanting to skip to the West Coast part, only to find that in some shows they just skip that game completely. But anyway, today I wanted to talk about some other news that came up. So it has come to my attention that Jaymie Graham is the latest high-profile candidate to rule himself out of the race to take on the job as West Coast Eagles senior coach next year, which took me by surprise. And there's already been some discussion about it. I watched the Shelter Footy Cast with Mark Reddings and Will Schofield, which is a great show. I tune into that every week. And they had plenty to say about it, and they had an interesting discussion. And I know Scoey's drawn some criticism for being or perceived as very negative on West Coast at the moment. So we're going to unpack, first of all, this story with Jaymie Graham, and I'll give my general thoughts on the situation. So my first reaction was that of surprise. I'm not going to lie. I'm quite surprised that Jaymie Graham has ruled himself out of this job. Now, he is the third or fourth person to do this. There was Dean Cox, Josh Carr, and Nathan Buckley we've also heard about. West Coast have sounded out these coaches. I'm actually not 100% sure about Josh Carr. I don't know if West Coast definitely approached him or if he just was asked about it publicly and he said no. So either way, that's kind of a growing list of coaches that have ruled themselves out. So I guess that's the first touching point of this particular video. To what extent should we be concerned by that? Look, I'm probably going to title this something clickable like "No one wants to coach the Eagles at the moment." That's just me doing my thing, so bear with me. But I actually think, speaking to that, I don't think is a massive deal. So let's go through them in isolation. Okay, Dean Cox, I've already talked about this on the channel, but him ruling himself out makes perfect sense when you see him explain himself. So for him, he's been established in Sydney. His wife has got a business. He's got 2 young kids, and things are going really well at the Sydney Swans. And there's talk of him taking over John Longmire. So while I thought he might have been tempted to come home to Western Australia and coach his former side, of which he is a club great, I do at least understand why he wouldn't want to move. Josh Carr, like I said, I don't even know if West Coast approached him or if he just ruled himself out. Similarly, though, well established at Port Adelaide as a senior assistant, again, talked about by many as the likely candidate to take over Hinkley when that eventually happens, and given Port Adelaide's list, I think that there's reasons for him to stay for sure. He is also more or less a Fremantle person, so wasn't too phased about that. Nathan Buckley, that was always a long shot. I don't know if Bucks is serious about getting back into coaching, and if he is, I think there's talk about him going to Tasmania in a few years, but either way, I think given his personal life, moving to Western Australia, that was always going to be a massive long shot, so, not phased about that. So the first one that probably got me a little bit surprised was Jaymie Graham. Now, Jaymie Graham has come out and said he's comfortable with what he's doing at Fremantle and really enjoying the ride that they're on and the journey that they're on. I've been given a good opportunity to develop and progress in my coaching career at Fremantle. It's clear I want to coach one day, but I'm not in a rush and really enjoying my role at Freo. So this one surprised me because Jaymie Graham has built up a pretty good wealth of experience now, and he's involved at a club that is relatively, they're more or less in the premiership window, probably at the start of it, I would say, depending how this season finishes, but you know what I mean. So he's built up a resume, a very rock-solid resume. I think he was senior coach for 1 game for us, so he's got a bit of a taste of it. He's an Eagles person, West Australian base. He probably wouldn't even have to move houses. So this one does surprise me. So we'll try and maybe speculate on why that is. And I think, if you go to the Shelter Footy Cast in that discussion, Scoey's stance is that this West Coast Eagles job is largely untouchable. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but it's not a great job to take at the moment, was his stance. Even with that in mind, I'm surprised. And the reason I'm surprised, I suppose, is because at the end of the day, senior coaching gigs in general are rarer than hen's teeth. There's so many assistant coaches around the league vying for essentially 18 positions, and how many come up in a year? I mean, there's been plenty of years where no coach gets sacked, and maybe the next year there's 2 or 3, and it probably averages out to about 1 or 1.5 vacancies per season. So with that in mind, and the value of coaching roles, and given the presumably large pay bump, like what are coaches on, like $1 million a year? What are assistants on? Half that, if that? I am speculating on that, but there is obviously a big financial uplift in taking on a senior role. So that's the first point that surprises me. Regardless of where you think a list is or how a club is going, it's still a big thing to turn down a senior role because, some of it's about timing. So the implication here is perhaps Jaymie Graham is holding out for a better senior coaching role. So that leads to the next point, and it's all senior coaching role changes, for the most part, 95%, I'm going to say off the top of my head, come at a time where a club is in flux and they're not going so well. It's usually because they've been sacked. Occasionally there'll be a handover, there'll be a retirement, I suppose, but those are actually pretty rare occurrences. Usually a senior coach is getting turfed, and they're getting turfed because the football club's not going so well. So to some extent, all coaching roles that are taken on are seen as some sort of challenge. So let's look at West Coast specifically. They are a couple of years into a rebuild, and the perception out there is that the playing list isn't very good. And it's hard to argue with that on the data. They haven't been a very good team for a while. My first point here is that coaches are not simply measured upon how many wins they get in a given year, whether they make finals, whether they compete for the premiership. It is all situational. It's contextual. Therefore, what I'm saying is the expectations and board aims of a club and what they want to achieve are different for every club. And my point being, at West Coast, expectations for wins and losses will be relatively low. They're looking for a coach who can take this group of players who are right at early stages of a rebuild. I wouldn't say right at the start. I think that's a myth. But early stages of a rebuild into, maturing and competing for finals. That's the first step. And with that comes less expectation on results. So it's not as though, whoever takes over from West Coast at the moment is going to be measured against the same standard as someone like a Simon Goodwin, who may come under pressure if Melbourne continue to, flail like they are at the moment. Or a Luke Beveridge, who comes under pressure, every 6 to 12 months, every time the Bulldogs dip a little bit below expectations. And for them, that's finals and competing for the top 6 to top 4. So what I'm saying is whoever takes off this job will have a little bit of a leash, especially when you consider West Coast have a long history of being loyal to coaches. And I suppose it's a new CEO and a new organisation, really, with the amount of change that's been seen there for a while there. But nonetheless, Woosha didn't get sacked, and Simo did, but many people argue that was later than it should have happened. So as far as job security goes, I don't think that's too bad. Now, if you're looking at the club from a list point of view, call me crazy, but I think, when you're assessing the quality of a list from the perspective of a team who is starting a rebuild or early in the rebuild, what you're really looking for is how much have they invested in youth. And West Coast have at least got a couple of drafts under their belt. I would say 3. We've got 4 first round picks currently on the list from this rebuild so far. Chesser, Ginbey, Hewitt, and Reid. Harley Reid looks like a generational talent. Ginbey looks like a gun, certainly as a defender. Hewitt is extremely talented, but obviously injured, and Chesser is a wait and see. He's probably 50-50 at this point. And that's just scratching the surface. My point being that we've at least had a few drafts, and there's also an entire draft in between now and round 1 2025 in which West Coast could hold a pick as early as pick 2. That could also be supplemented by Tom Barrass leaving, so that's another top 10 pick potentially, and then we could trade that down and end up with 3 first round draft picks this year. So in terms of assessing the list, I would contrast it to someone like a Richmond and Adam Uze at the moment, who have not been able to get their hands into the draft yet, and that might change. They might blow up their list this offseason. But even still, I would just suggest that West Coast have at least made some inroads into turning over their list. And so with that in mind, I don't think West Coast are necessarily starting from scratch, and I do think things can change quickly. So, I'm projecting this on Jaymie Graham, and we're kind of guessing that he doesn't want to go to West Coast, presumably because he thinks it's a job that is destined to fail. And I have to say, there's no disrespect intended to Jaymie Graham. He seems like an amazing person. And again, I don't know what his reasoning is truly for turning down this job, other than to suggest that he's hoping to enhance his resume by potentially being a senior assistant at a Fremantle group that could potentially win a premiership or at least contend for a few years and thus enhance his resume. Why would he want to do that? To potentially get a better job down the line. So assuming this is a case of Jaymie Graham not thinking this is a good job to take, I have to say it kind of speaks to a lack of self-belief. So if a coach is looking at this job thinking, I don't know if I can do this, then to be fair, I probably don't want a senior coach that has that attitude. Again, projecting on Jaymie Graham an attitude that I don't know if he actually has. But yeah, in summary, I suppose it's just curious, senior coaching gigs are pretty rare, and Jaymie Graham could hang around it a couple of years or a few more years at Fremantle, really enhance that resume, and then it might come at a time when senior coaching gigs might not be gone. Or who knows what might happen. Fremantle might have an off season and then they might shake up their coaching structure. There's just risk associated with that. And I think in this industry, which is unpredictable and a bit of a roller coaster at times, it's an interesting play to delay the senior coaching gig for potentially a bigger payoff in the future when you get, a better job down the line. There's also been an implication that, I'm not sure if Scully meant to imply this, but I've also seen it around the traps. But there's this idea that West Coast are not necessarily looking for the next premiership coach. They're looking for a rebuild coach in the interim. I'm not sure if I fully buy that. I understand the logic for thinking that, given West Coast seems so far off premiership contention right now. But my personal opinion is I don't think West Coast would reach out to a favourite son in Dean Cox, who is a highly qualified senior assistant and well-respected coach around the league and a legend of the football club, with any kind of intention for this to just be a temporary role. I think they want someone there for the long haul. Someone to get us to from where we're at now, which is so far off even the middle part of the competition, to being at least around there and starting to then look to contend. And historically, how many times has a team actually done that? Does a team hire a rebuild coach and then sack him when they haven't actually underperformed? I can think of one. I want to say Guy McKenna. They did that at the Gold Coast Suns with Guy McKenna, who took them for a few years, and then they shafted him for Rodney Eade, and that ended up being absolutely horrible. But other than that, I can't think of coaches who get sacked and upgraded without actually underperforming. And I don't believe that is the West Coast way either. I'm again speculating, but I don't think West Coast are looking at this as a temporary role. It is absolutely going to be a job and a project that will come in separate parts. And the first phase is getting us to at least be a team that has, a strong young core that looks like they could take us to the next level. And then the next phase is actually competing. But I'm not sure if I agree with the assertion that West Coast is lining up one coach to get us to the middle part of the ladder and then I'm going to upgrade it for a more senior one. I don't think they would do that, particularly if they were serious about trying to get someone like a Dean Cox. As for Jaymie Graham himself, I think it's always better when you have a strong pool of candidates applying for this job. I didn't have any particular feelings about him being the senior coach going forward. And honestly, my current leaning is, and we're all speculating from the outside, and none of us, unless you're involved with the club and the recruiting process, none of us are fully qualified to have assessments on this. However, I can't help but lean towards Jared Schofield at this current point in time. Now, that's not just because of how we've performed under him so far, which I think has been largely decent. 2 good honourable losses against quality teams, 1 horrendous loss with all our best players missing admittedly, but still a bad loss, and then a win on the weekend. And, depending on how he can close out this season, you'd think he's actually performing quite well. But it's not even because of that. I've liked him for a long time. I was stoked when we got him from Port Adelaide. Did a great job at Subiaco. He was involved at Port Adelaide for a few years while they were good. I suppose the only argument against him is that he's been involved in West Coast and, around stoppages in the midfield, which has been the weakest part of our team for a while now. So there's an argument against that when you want to maybe bring in someone with a fresh perspective. But I'm not sure if I fully agree that, he should be tarnished with that just because he was involved at the club. I think there's so many things going wrong and talent has also been a big part of that. He's also his own man. He's not necessarily going to be Adam Simpson 2.0. And, I think there's a real identity to the way this team has played in the 4 weeks under him that is congruent. Is congruent mean the same? It's congruent with, how his Subiaco team performed, a fierce team that plays aggressively and on the edge. And it feels like there's a bit more of a whoosher sort of like identity to the way they're playing. Again, small sample size, but to be honest, that is the way I'm leaning at the moment. I'm kind of hoping Jared Schofield is the coach that takes us forward going forward. I'm also pretty open to Ash Hansen, but again, more of this will start to unfold as the season winds up and we get a little bit more serious about this coaching stuff. But yeah, to summarize, Jaymie Graham's pulled out. I don't think it's a massive deal that heaps of coaches have pulled out because individually they've all had their own reasons until Jaymie Graham, which surprised me. And then speculating on why he doesn't want to coach us also surprises me, given every team that turns over their coach is probably in some degree of spot of bother. Yes, West Coast are at the bottom part of the rebuild, but that should in theory come with lower expectations. I don't think West Coast is going to slap a finals expectation on the coach that takes over in 2025. Also, given the fact that he's a former West Coast player and, probably doesn't even have to move house to take this job, the pay rise, I'm a little bit baffled, but again, everyone may have their own reasons. At this moment, not completely devastated because I am hoping for Jared Schofield, but if Jared Schofield pulls out, if Ash Hansen pulls out, that's where you'll have me worried. But let me know in the comments what you think, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Go Eagles.